Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper, conversations on leadership, life and lessons learned, often the hard way. This week, Bobby and Bridge are joined by two incredible guests from Fighting with Pride, the LGBT+ military charity. Colonel Ali Brown, OBE, who among her many other roles serves as a trustee for the charity, and Alex Meyrick, a community worker with the organisation. There's so much to discuss in this episode, landing just in time for National Coming Out Day on October the 11th. We'll be talking about the charity itself and the support they are giving to veterans, the lifting of the gay ban in the military in January 2000, and of course personal stories about leadership, how you live when your voice cannot truly be heard, and more. So join us for this most important conversation on being allowed to be proud. Ali, Alex, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So we may well start with one of our topics from a recording being more than just a job title. So I've said very little about either of you. So I wondered if we could start with you giving the introduction that you would like to have of yourself on this recording. Ali?
Thank you. I had a fairly traditional upbringing, went to university, but knew that I'd always wanted to join the army. So I went to university and joined the army from university and was in the first female intake ever to go to Sandhurst. So that was 230 years of male dominance broken. At that time, joined the Women's Royal Army Corps because that was the only corps that women could join prior to 92. But I, for one, was quite pleased when the WRC disbanded because it meant I could go into the wider army. And I transferred to the Adjutant General's Corps like a lot of women of that era. I then spent the next 29 years in the army. I was fortunate enough to serve at a time where a lot of the restrictive terms relaxed. And I was lucky enough to go on operations because the deployment rules changed. So all in all, it was a very, very fulfilling and challenging career, which had a few disadvantages as well. I decided to leave the army early because I met somebody and I wanted to be with that person. And I decided that I couldn't be with that person whilst I was still serving. So that was my reason for leaving. And since then, I've been involved in the charity sector. And I do most work with female veterans, identifying gaps in services and trying to improve those services. So I've kind of come full circle. When I left the army, I thought I would never want to get involved with the military ever again. But actually, that's where my heart is. That's where my home is. And that really is my passion, improving things for females, veterans that I found difficult. So I guess that's a very short synopsis of me.
That's fabulous. Thanks so much, Ali. And Alex?
I'm afraid that my intro is going to be significantly shorter than Ali's, but yes, I'd love to. So I am the veteran community worker for London, and I work with Fighting with Pride. I don't have any service history myself, but I am a very proud military spouse. My soon-to-be wife has now been in the army for coming up to 4 years, so her first 4 years in. But it was so important to me when this job first came up that I really went for it. This is something that I've always been passionate about, LGBT+ history, and in particular, the history of the charity and working for a lived experience charity was really important to me. My own personal history, I went in the day of my 16th birthday to the NHS and I utterly loved it. There was something about public service that really, really struck a chord with me. And like I say, it was actually my partner who is currently serving that found the job. And it just seemed ideal. This is a part of LGBT+ history and military history that not a lot of people know. And the more that I was researching into it, the more it became apparent that it wasn't as widely known about how many women were affected by this in particular, actually. And so as I was doing research in preparation for my interview, which I felt terribly nervous about, it was something that became really apparent to me. A lot of people, when I sort of email them and arrange to meet, because a lot of my work is meeting with ban-affected veterans, are surprised at my age. So quite a young woman turns up, civvy, but I like to think, and I've been told, that I have a real affinity with people and really understand exactly what it is that they're going through just because of that LGBT+ element of the community of which I'm so proudly a part of. So it's a real honour and a joy to be doing this job, but it also feels incredibly momentous. I don't think we can really understate the work that we're doing here and the communities that we're working with, and how far sort of this runs deep within them. So I'm very, very proud to be doing that. My role at Fighting with Pride, as Ali will, I'm sure, be able to tell you, is incredibly varied. I do all sorts from one-on-one support for veterans, and signposting them onto and staying with them onto the support that they deserve but didn't really realise was out there, right up until organising national events, so things like Remembrance, things like Prides, which are often a real joy because we're seeing a group of people who were never afforded the opportunity to take part in those things come along and take part proudly, which is really wonderful. So, as I say, a significantly shorter CV than Ali's, but yeah, I'm really, really proud to be doing the job.
So maybe just for the benefit of the listeners, not everyone who listens to the podcast are military. And Alex, as you said, really a lot of people may know about the background and how it affected male soldiers and officers, but maybe just an explanation, either from maybe Ali, if you could explain what Fighting with Pride is about, and in a way, we're reaching this 25th year anniversary of the ruling that ultimately led to what was being called the gay ban being lifted. Maybe just a quick explanation for everyone who's listening.
Fighting with Pride was formed by a number of parties who were actually directly affected by the ban. In other words, they had been dismissed, or their service had become so untenable that they had to leave. And the whole kind of issue had kind of been put under the radar, had been pushed under the carpet, and hadn't really been recognised by anyone to be the utter traumatic experience that it was for gay people to serve in the British Army, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. And so Fighting with Pride was born to try and not only publicise the issue, but also care for those veterans who had been deeply affected by their experiences. And then that has evolved into a campaigning side to Fighting with Pride, very much borne out by the Etherton Review, which has given a lot of recommendations as to how the wrongs of the past should be righted. And there are many recommendations, most of which have been actioned, apart from the financial restitution, which is still with the government awaiting decisions. So Fighting with Pride is very much about communication. It's about informing people what happened, why it happened, who it happened to, and really giving voice to those people who were silenced so many years ago. And these people never received any kind of compensation, never received any kind of apology, never received any kind of due regard to the experiences they went to. And of course, some of the veterans went to prison, found themselves on the sex offenders register, and others were just literally told to leave that day and never come back after very traumatic interviews by the Special Investigations Branch. So for me as a trustee, and of course I work at a strategic level, whereas Alex is very much, doing the action on the ground. For me, Fighting with Pride is all about giving those people voice because they never had a voice, exposing the wrongs of the past, liaising with government and statutory organisations to right those wrongs of the past, and also bring the community together. There's nothing that supports the community more than having each other. And in my view, that's particularly so with women. Women support women. And the strength of the women that we have in Fighting with Pride is that we have all formed a very, very close bond. And I don't think it's an overstatement to what Alex has said when you think that 69% of respondents to the Etherton Review were women. So there was an overwhelming harm done to these women, and Fighting with Pride has formed to try and right those wrongs and welcome those veterans back into the military community.
Thanks, Ali. I have to say, I saw, I don't know whether it was yesterday or the day before, on the Sandhurst Sisterhood website, the coverage of, I don't know whether it was the first but certainly one of the largest ceremonies to hand back cap badges to women who had been forced to leave in any or all of the ways that you've described. And it was in Perth, I think.
I think that was the first of many. The Women's Royal Army Corps Association is handling all those. That one was the first. We have another big event coming up in Guildford, the spiritual home of the WRAC, where we're going to be giving cap badges and berets to, we think, about 10 women. The important thing is it's done by a senior serving woman. And that's quite important to bring the past and the present together. And that's really key.
So, Ali, I'm pretty sure it was something that I was reading on the website, the Fighting with Pride website, which was around 3 key things. And I think that it's talking to the things that you're saying around the journey home, making connections and building bridges. And I think when I started looking at this about, well, why the rationale? And of course, I knew a little of the history, but when we're looking back about, there's certain times when things were criminalised, and then there seemed to be a lull in World War II, and then we're back, and then we get to 1993, which I think is at the period of time, Ali, when you were serving, and so were Bridget and I. I had no idea about don't ask, don't tell, and so being discharged if you were to disclose that you were gay. And so I think with the handing back of the berets and the journey home piece, just I wondered if you could talk to just quite how different it is for people that you have met coming from the different eras, because it was different in the 50s than it was in the 60s, 70s, etc.
I think the experience of LGBT plus serving personnel, particularly women, has changed. It's changed immeasurably over the last 70 years. Not only in, the roles they were allowed to do, but also the social acceptability. And certainly when I joined in 84, I didn't know I was gay. I had no idea. And the first thing I did was to get married to a man, which very quickly ended in divorce. But I don't remember at the time even being aware that to be gay was illegal. Certainly when I joined my first unit, I became aware. But I didn't really give it much of a second thought, if I'm perfectly honest. I was a junior officer, trying to cope with the world around me, just got married, and I don't remember giving it much thought at all. I think I started to realise the impact in the late 80s, because, of course, that wasn't a don't ask, don't tell era. That was the SIB are going to investigate and kick you out. So that was very much in that era. And I think that was different from the 50s and 60s. And I don't think many women actually suffered at the hands of the SIB in the 50s and 60s, because it was kind of thought, well, women couldn't really be gay. It wasn't a thing. Society said it couldn't happen, therefore it didn't happen. I think awareness probably started in the 60s with the sort of freedom of communication in Civvy Street and the freedom to be who you are and embrace who you are. And I think that's when women who were serving kind of thought, well, yeah, we're going to be who we are too. And I think that's when the forces decided to have this really hard line, which I think was probably in existence from about 65 until about 92. And that hard line was, if you're gay, you're going to be chucked out. You're going to be dismissed if you're a woman. You're going to be court-martialed if you're a man. And the way the two were treated, as you can see, was quite different. Just as bad, but quite different. And I think I became aware of that, as I say, in the late 80s. And I began to realise just what a dangerous line people like me were treading. I think as we moved into the early 90s, we saw the relaxation of the terms and conditions of service. Women could stay in if they got pregnant. That was a real thing back then. I can't tell you how revolutionary that was, that women could actually have children and stay in. And also women could deploy. They could go on operations. They could go into the first Gulf War, as I did. And the whole world was changing. And with it, there came a relaxation, if you like, of those really hardline SIB investigations. And we moved into a don't ask, don't tell. And I think the vast majority of people who were living the life I was kind of thought that was okay. It was better. It didn't mean you were publicly out when you were serving. It meant you still, hid like we always hid. But you weren't in fear of the SIB coming knocking on your door anymore. And that fear kind of gradually went away in the 90s to be replaced by, I suppose, silence and lies. And I think every single one of us did lie along the way at some point. And then, of course, in 2000, the ban was lifted. But again, I think because I'd served so long by then, when the ban was lifted, there was no public coming out for me. There was no rejoicing. I don't remember at the time thinking, oh, it's okay then. In fact, I didn't come out to my family until I left the army. I stayed in the hidden world I'd chosen until I was 47. And when I was 47, I finally told the truth. And I think that's all about that conditioning through those decades. And I think those that served in the late 80s and the early 80s and the late 70s, they were so conditioned by that harsh line that was held by the SIB and the authorities, obviously, that they never really felt free to be honest, because you were so scared during that era. So really different as the decades moved on. But I think a lot of people like me were so heavily conditioned that we just kept quiet.
I suppose just the segue onto that is this the support that's now required for the people that are coming to the charity because of what it's like to have stayed quiet for so long?
Yeah, I mean, there was no support. Before Fighting with Pride was formed, there was absolutely nothing. There was no one to pick them up in civilian life. There was certainly no outreach from the military sector. There were no specific bespoke services back then. But of course, in Civvy Street, mental health wasn't high on the agenda either. And it certainly wasn't high on the agenda in the forces. So I think, again, the evolving decades brought the realization that people who had been treated like this and had been forcibly ejected from their careers of choice in a hugely damning way required support, but it just wasn't there. So I think with the formation of things like Op Courage, for example, NHS England, mental health services for veterans, the world started opening up and the world started to think, well, actually, perhaps we should support these people. And I think Fighting with Pride was very much at the forefront of that. And I like to think that Fighting with Pride has now provided the template that other charities could now support their LGBT plus veterans with.
Thanks, Ali. Alex, I just wonder a couple of things that Ali's talked about in terms of even when the ban was lifted, that really many people just continued as they had been. And I think that Bobby and I, in a previous episode, had talked about vulnerability and particularly actually about men and the difficulties they have in being vulnerable, showing vulnerability, and particularly then with the added element of the military and the sort of understandings of how men should be in the military. And that we had really thought that there's a number of our generation, who are now in the 50s, mid 50s, men who we know from the military who still haven't felt able to come out, or certainly publicly, who may still be in the military or may have left the military at an older age, but still not feel able or safe or secure to be able to come out. And I just wondered whether that's something that you've seen in the people that you work with.
Absolutely. Without a doubt, there's still these echoes of the ban in people's sort of everyday lives. You can see how it's this thread that's been woven from the point that they were arrested, not even just the point of discharge, but the point that they thought maybe even the circle was closing. It's this thread of unease, distrust, having to hide, this thread of shame, which is a horrible thing to have seen. And then you couple that up with this very military, especially when you're talking in the concept of men, this arena of having to push every individual emotion down because it's about the person that's next to you, the person that's shoulder to shoulder. You can start to see this pattern of, well, I don't want to reach out for help because that was something I was conditioned sort of not to do, to reach out for support and talk about how I'm feeling. But then on top of that, they're completely compounded by this fact of, well, I was found out, and I can't trust anyone anyway, because even if I was able to come out and talk about how I was feeling or what I was thinking, or, I mean, you're talking about very young people who, as Ali said, most of whom that we support went into the forces as very, very young people and had no idea what they were. I didn't come out, I mean, relatively early terms, I didn't come out till I was 19, but through this job, I've got lots and lots of friends and now chosen family who have come out at every aspect of life, and you can't expect sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds to fully know who they are. So once you've got this culture in you that says we don't do we don't do reaching out, we don't do talking about how you're feeling individually, it's about you as a unit, and then compounded on top of that is you're in danger if you do speak out about something as profound and personal as your sexuality. It creates a pattern that follows you into life. A lot of what we do is about rebuilding trust and reintegration and welcoming people back into the fold. There's a huge amount of people who we consider ban affected. So anybody who was LGBT plus and served during the years of the ban, regardless of the outcome, whether they hid and managed to have a career, whether they felt the circle closing and felt they had no choice but to leave, or whether they did get a discharge, you see that they may not even have come out yet. You see that they're not going to go to the traditional sort of avenues of support, and there's there's still that fear. A lot of our veterans talk about a fear to this day of getting too comfortable, a fear of there's always going to be a knock at the door, there's always going to be somebody questioning, and that's really what we're trying to do at Fighting with Pride is show them that it doesn't have to be like that anymore. There's always going to be pockets, but all in all, the forces is a wonderful place to be these days if you're LGBT plus and you don't have to live in the shadows anymore. And there are people that want to and are willing to help you and help you access the support you deserve. But I would say that, it just echoes throughout everyone's lives, regardless of how on the surface successful or not successful life may have been post forces.
I suppose just the segue onto that is this the support that's now required for the people that are coming to the charity because of what it's like to have stayed quiet for so long. Also, there's two thoughts that I've got going on. I mean, I am so pleased to hear of all the work that Fighting with Pride is doing, and things that I have been reading, some of which are quite current, talks about change being glacially slow, I think was the quote that I saw. And then there were other things being said about the military being built on a requirement for male masculinity, male energy. I'm thinking, well, thanks very much for that. That sort of like continues to decry the things that I did, the things that Bridget did, the things that Ali was doing, whatever our sexual orientation. And I'm just wondering how you are finding the experience for people in the military now. Are they feeling that change is glacially slow, or are they finding that it's not the place that it was that we were talking about with Ali's experience a little while?
I think change is glacially slow. Change has always been that slow in the forces. If you think how long it took for the military to allow women to get married and stay in, that's the mid-70s. Have a family, you're talking about the early 90s, deployability the early 90s. So I think change within the military environment is always slow. But what is in place now, talking to people who are still serving, is there are policies, there are processes, there are procedures, there's a complaints process, none of which was there when I joined, none of it. And the attitude, and I do believe this, the attitude of those that matter, and I'm talking about the senior officers, has changed in a sense that everybody is valuable. The forces are much smaller. Their role is much smaller. The money is much less. So everybody who joins up is important. And I think the slowness of change is a lot to do with the culture. And culture is incredibly difficult to change. I think if you looked at the NHS, if you looked at the legal profession, my elder sister was in the police force. I mean, the same slow change of culture happens everywhere. And I think there is still some use of very outdated terminology like you just described. Male energy and male masculinity. I think that isn't inclusive terminology. It's not inclusive at all, is it? And I think there is a move to try and use inclusive terminology. But old habits die hard. And women are still only, the RAF has 18%, the Navy has 14%, and the Army's lagging behind at 11%. It's still only a small percent of the overall force. So, as with any minority, there are going to be differences in the way they're referred to. But do I think it's better than it was when I served? Absolutely. Some of the things that happened to me and my cohort are now illegal. Well, that's a great progress. But I think culture change is slow everywhere. So I'm not kind of defending the military, but I am saying that it's very complicated and there are so many layers to it. But I think every person in the military is more valued now, partly because of necessity, let's face it, because recruiting is not great. But yeah, it is slow, and I think it always will be.
Ali, I'm interested that you refer to this sort of pragmatism that may have contributed to some of the culture change, albeit slow. This idea that there's less money, there are fewer people. So actually, you've got to embrace and accept the people that you've got. However, and that might be, a little cynical, but I agree. I suspect that there is an element of that plays into it. Because obviously this is a podcast about leadership, and I'm just wondering, maybe if you've got, and Alex, the same question to you, both of you, if you can answer this, because you're both leaders in your roles, you've been leaders and you are leaders. What are organisations, and obviously particularly the Army, missing out on when they don't embrace this diversity, when they force people to hide who they are, and whether that is because of their sexuality, their religion, the country that they come from, all of those things? What are organisations losing? And what did the Army lose for a long time when it was forcing all of those people?
Well, there's only one word for me, and the answer is talent. They lost out on talent. They lost out on skilled individuals. They lost out on people who stuck their hand up and said, I want to serve my country. And I know that might sound old-fashioned, but people who actually put their hand up and say, I want to serve my country, are pretty valuable to any workforce. So they lost out on that, the full extent of the skills. They lost out on those individuals as people, i.e. joining in with the military community. And they lost out on the breadth of characteristics, the breadth of those characters that were forced to leave. It was just so short-sighted. I mean, looking back, I'm stunned by the short-sightedness of that decision, particularly to keep the ban going for as long as 2000. I find that, again, looking back, now I'm out of it, now I'm out of uniform, I can look back much better. When you're in it, you don't often have the time to do it. But I am stunned by the fact that in 1999, that ban was still in place. And the forces were still losing out on talent and still losing out on those skills, which they could ill afford to do. And with any employment and any working force, pragmatism comes into it because there is a finite amount of money. So, yeah, looking back, I am a bit stunned that it lasted so long and that the forces were prepared to take that loss for so long. That's what surprises me.
Yeah, I have to say, just before we move on to Alex, I was studying to be a barrister in 2001, actually, and the ban had just been lifted. We did a lot of studying about European law and about constitutional law, etc., etc. And I was really surprised that the Army fought it. So, I mean, if they had to, essentially, the government had to fight that all the way to Europe. So at any point, they could have said, yeah, you're right, you know what, we don't need to. But it went to the House of Lords and then it went to the European Court because they wouldn't back down. And I join in your, just incredulity really as to the amount of money that must have been spent on all of those legal fees to just keep going rather than going, yeah, okay, times have changed. Let's go with it. So anyway, yes, I share your incredulity. Alex, anything that you would like to add into that?
Well, in terms of why, and not just the military, everybody should be looking at diversity. I was about to say it's not always what you gain, but exactly as Ali said, it's what you lose, and you lose so much talent and breadth of experience. And we're an increasingly, and in my view, it's fantastic, and I wouldn't have it any other way, but we're an increasingly diverse and multicultural place, and we're all so much more well connected, and the world seems like such a smaller place. And why would you not want the voices, opinions, and experiences of as many different people as you can, especially if we're going down the pragmatic view? And why wouldn't you? Because it will attract more people in. But I also think it's about culture and workplace culture. And you want your people, and if, again, we're talking about retention, especially in the context of today's forces, why would you not want your people who are there willingly and doing an excellent job to not feel as comfortable and as happy as possible? But it also feeds into a culture of being able to raise things when things have gone wrong. And that's really, really important for building trust. But when you're delivering a public service, as I believe defence do, and the NHS as well, you need trust from the people that you're out there and on the ground to help as well. And including a wider breadth of people, and people who the public can relate to and reflect more of a population, is only ever going to be a good thing for building trust. And I think that's hugely important. So for me, I'm essentially agreeing with what Ali said. It's absolutely about talent, and there's so much talent from such a wider, deeper pool than ever was years previous. But I also I think it's hugely important to maintain trust. It's hugely important.
I'm intrigued by the word talent, and equally cannot quite believe that for all the years that I was serving, up until 2000, this ban stayed in place. And it wasn't until I was reading back and doing a little bit of research for this recording that I saw that in 1995 that there was a survey done of 15,000 serving personnel where it was 80% still wanted the ban upheld. I mean, I certainly didn't get the questionnaire, thank you very much, but I would not have been one of those 80%. But that just astounded me again, that was happening. And a bit like you were saying, Ali, that whilst it probably wasn't front of mind whilst you were serving, and more so now I feel the same, that things that were happening right in front of me and I really wasn't very cognizant of at all.
I was going to say, I did get the survey, the questionnaire, and I did fill it in. But, and there's always a but with these things, isn't it? It depends who you distribute that questionnaire to. If you distribute that questionnaire to a load of infantry units, perhaps, let's say, or other units within the army, and I would be interested to know how the RAF and the Royal Navy filled that questionnaire in, which I don't know. But you can do it in a certain way where the questionnaire isn't distributed on inclusive terms. So you're going to get the answer you want, because that's where the real argument against operational effectiveness, and operational effectiveness was bought out for most of the arguments that happened in the 80s, the 90s and the noughties. You know, it would reduce operational effectiveness to have women deployed. It would reduce operational effectiveness to have women have children. It would reduce operational effectiveness to have LGBT plus serving. But slowly but surely, that terminology became completely discredited because it was proven that that just wasn't the case. And, you know, LGBT plus personnel have been serving for time immemorial. They didn't suddenly arrive in 1967. They've been there all the time. So I think to a certain degree, the forces got the answer they wanted until the question became obsolete. And as soon as the question became obsolete, then the answer became obvious. And I think that's how it kind of went.
And I think that where I was heading, having seen that, absolutely along the same lines as you, get the answer that you've made the control system that you actually wanted. And as you're rightly pointing out, that talent has been there all the time. I know I served with talented people from the LGBTQ plus community. So that's not going to be the question about what difference does it make in terms of leadership. But the question I did want to ask you, Ali, is that element of having to hide at least a part of you, a part of what makes up your full makeup, Did that have any impact on how you felt you led that you have thought about and reflected on?
Yes, is the short answer is yes. Longer answer is once I had realised that I was gay and that I wanted to continue in the army, I kind of made a bit of a pact with myself. And I think I morphed quite quickly into quite a hard individual, quite a stern, individual. And I think that translated into a very, I'm going to call it masculine leadership style. I was in charge of men. I didn't have many women working for me, or indeed, I didn't have any bosses who were women. So I was in a very masculine world. And I think I adopted the leadership styles of those around me. And I built a very high brick wall around me. I never let anybody in. I didn't talk about anything remotely personal at work. I didn't attend, work dues, leaving functions. I didn't do any of that. I only socialised as little as I could get away with. So I didn't go on nights out with the boys, my team. I just didn't do that. And I became, I think, quite a standoff figure, quite a stern leader who people just didn't want to cross, just didn't want to engage with, just, they kind of did as they were told. And any softness I might have had, I completely eradicated because I wanted to survive. And in that surviving, my behaviour had to be a certain way, and that's how I chose to do it. I actually don't think I could have adopted any other leadership style. I think to protect myself, it was always going to go that way. And if you adopt a masculine leadership style, for want of a better word, you morph into the rest and you don't become noticeable. And I think that's what I chose to do. I think for me, the main kind of enlightening, if you like, was meeting somebody that I actually wanted to be with that was worth giving up the army. I think for me, that was my crossroads in the sand, because I knew that if I didn't grasp this relationship, I would lose it. And yes, I might continue my career and get promoted, etc., but I wasn't going to have that fulfilling home life. And so I credit, my partner with doing that. And I think I have become a nicer person. I've become a more thoughtful person. I now do think about other people a lot more. I try and understand people a bit more than I used to. I don't dismiss vulnerability as weakness, which I always used to do. I don't know whether I'm very good at being vulnerable myself. I haven't had much practice in doing that, but I don't dismiss others anymore. And I used to do that very, very quickly. I was very judgmental. So I think I've become softer in those ways. And I think also my range of emotions is better. I do feel happy, sad, all the other things that you would expect a human being to feel. Whereas when I was in uniform, there was a bit of a blank in me, a bit of a gap. I can't really describe it, but it was as if inside I just didn't feel anything. I couldn't allow myself to feel anything. Whereas now I do. And I think I'm a better person for it. You'd have to ask my partner as to what she thinks, but hopefully she would agree. I hope she would agree anyway.
Alex, one of the questions that when Bobby and I were looking at this episode, I think that Bobby had raised this issue about maybe an opinion about the type of leadership. And I, just to say, if you don't want to answer this question, that's absolutely fine. But talked about sort of the humanity of a leadership that is not just saying that it's not okay to be gay in the army, but to go after people and to punish them. And particularly then for the law enforcers, the people who were like the witch catchers, going out searching for evidence to convict people of the crime of being gay. And as Bobby said, and I probably was in the same situation, wasn't really something that didn't occur to us. It wasn't on our radar. We didn't really see that. And I just wonder, in terms of leadership, what you think about that.
It is a really tough one. And as Ali says, I'm sort of boots on the ground coming into contact with veterans and also non-ban veterans, veterans who were, like yourself, serving at the time of the ban. And it's always really, really interesting to hear from people. We've had such a range of reactions to the work that we're doing. I think it's really important, before I answer this, to note that what Fighting with Pride is doing and the work that we're doing for inclusion within the LGBT plus civilian world is probably not that radical, probably not that up to date. It's probably, a couple of years behind the bigger civvy LGBT plus charities. But when you take that in the context of what we do within the armed forces, what we're doing here in terms of trying to bring LGBT plus veterans back into the fold after this profound experience and trauma that they went through, and also bringing LGBT veterans and the LGBT plus community to the sort of military and particularly veterans charity sphere, can sometimes feel quite radical in a different way. And so we've had a myriad of reactions to the work that we do and who we work with. The majority of people, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, depending on how you feel, have been incredible. We've been so warmly welcomed back, as in the royal we, as in my veterans, have been so warmly welcomed back, and us as Fighting with Pride. But it's an interesting point. We know that at some point in a room at an event, one of our veterans will bump into somebody who was in direct leadership, their chain of command, or even was the person that arrested them or ended their career. And we get a range of reactions, I suppose. There's always, it's very, very difficult because there's always that argument of, well, they were just the rules. And when you're in the forces and when you're in an arena like that, you just follow the rules. And we were told that, anyone who was found to be LGBT plus or gay under the ban, they had to go. They were a danger to operational effectiveness. You also have a range of people in leadership positions who, much like yourself, didn't realise the extent of what was going on and didn't realise quite what would happen after the fact of reporting or a suspicion raised. And I think that's important to note, is that although it was happening, it wasn't particularly broadcast from what I've heard from people we had a range of people come up to us afterwards to say, I have always wondered what happened to that person who was in the bed next to me in the block or in the barracks, and we woke up one morning and they just weren't there, and we were told that they were ill or there was a family emergency or they'd been thrown out, but we were never given a reason. And I think that's also interesting to explore as well. But it is a difficult question because there's such a range of reactions to it. But the overwhelming feeling that you get when you're speaking to people in leadership positions at the time who perhaps had to oversee these decisions, some of whom were LGBT plus themselves, is that if they were LGBT plus themselves, it was often out of a sense of self-preservation. It was out of a sense of duty because that was the rules and you just followed them, which is, the culture of the forces. You're very much told what to do and you follow it. It's an order. But it is really, really difficult. I hope it made sense. It was really tricky.
No, it's super helpful, and it's really great that you bring that spectrum of that. It's not black and white. It's not good and evil.
It certainly isn't black and white. There's this whole spectrum of reaction, and we have had it in the past where somebody has come up to us completely distraught because their one action is, the person that comes to mind, I believe, was a medic, and so was involved in sort of what some people experienced as the sort of medical side of their discharge, because that did happen to some people, and just expressed such sincere regret and that it has followed them for not only the rest of their career but life post forces. And sort of us giving a talk, or my CEO Caroline Page, or even Ali, or one of the trustees, delivering a talk at a conference or an event has really brought that up for them. But it is something that they've thought about every day. So you can't just say black and white, oh, no one really thought about it after the fact because it was just what they did. I think a lot of people continue to think about those who had to leave under the ban. And from my experiences talking to people, and this certainly isn't universal, there's certainly a proportion of them that question those actions and question the decisions that led to that.
Some great conversation there. So the question that we always like to ask the people that we have come and guest for us, which we're very appreciative of, is what would you have your younger self have to say to you now? So we turn it on its head. We're always very willing to want to give our younger selves sage advice, but we have a belief that there is so much that our younger selves have held onto that we've somehow dumbed down. And I think that this is absolutely such a key question for this conversation, again, with National Coming Out Day, when I also have read that it's not a one-off event. I think with the things that we're hearing is that you are often having to say it again and again, if you choose to, in different environments, in different situations. And so I think that question about what would you have your younger self say to you now is really key. So Ali, what would you have your younger self say?
It's really interesting. No one's actually ever asked me about the other way before. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. I was actually thinking about this quite recently, and my background is all sort of patchworky. I actually started in theatre, and I moved to London to go to drama school. And then I was thinking about this recently and thinking about the work that I'm doing with Fighting with Pride and how far I've come in a couple of years and hopefully how much I've helped people. That's always the reason I do it. And I hope that my younger self would ask me where all my ambition has gone, because I think over time you do start to, that ambition, you when you're sort of 12, you think you can do anything. And I spent a lot of my childhood and my younger years thinking that I genuinely could believe everything. And so I hope that my younger self would be like, you've done really well and this is incredible and the life that you've built for yourself is amazing, but where's all your ambition gone? And I think that would be an interesting thing. But just to bring up what you said about constantly having to come out as well, that's a huge thing in the community, because you're having to do it in every aspect of your life. You're having to do it at doctor's surgery when you give next of kin, you're having to do it at the shop when you're trying to find something because your partner sent someone, and you're thinking about pronouns and the use of pronouns all the time. You're thinking about safety, and I do wish that in the future for younger generations wouldn't be a thing. But I think my younger self would just be really, really pleased and bemused at the fact that I am living openly and proudly with a partner who is able to do exactly what they want, and that's not a non-acknowledgement of those people that went before us. And I think that is only enhancing my partner's career in our lives as well, that we have such a deep understanding of what went before us. But in terms of my younger self, it would definitely be about ambition, and maybe asking why that ambition is dulled, because I don't think there needs to be a real reason why it does dull over time. I don't see a reason why we shouldn't stay as ambitious as our 12-year-old selves performing in front of the mirror should be.
I think ambition can be all sorts of different sizes, and it sort of like ebbs and flows.
Absolutely.
So that's lovely, and well done, younger self. Thank you. Ali?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I struggle with it, actually, to find an answer to it. I was quite a funny little kid, I think, in that I was very much a tomboy. And in the days when being a tomboy just meant wanting to play football and not being allowed to at school because girls couldn't play football. So I made up my mind to join the army when I was very young, having no concept what that meant. And I think I was quite a unemotional little kid. I was very driven at school. I was, driven to get to this military career. And I think, I'm not sure if I'm getting it the right way round, actually, but I think I'd like my younger self to tell me that emotions are okay. I think I probably started dulling down my emotions when I was about 15-ish, when I guess ambition and drive and everything else becomes, important. And up to that time, I was probably quite a free little child. I did what I wanted to do. I had a very rural upbringing. So, and I feel like I've come full circle in that I kind of had 30 years where I didn't have any emotions, really. And now I'm back to being full of emotion again. So I feel like I've kind of returned to that 9-year-old kid who was full of emotions and who could laugh and cry and talk to lots of people and feel things. But there was certainly 30 years when I didn't really feel very much, which sounds a bit sad, but it kind of isn't sad. It's just kind of the evolution that I had to go through. So I think that's what I would say. My younger self realised the importance of emotions and being able to voice them. And that's what I think I would hang on to now. I hope that's kind of answered it in a roundabout kind of way.
Ali, that made absolute sense to me in terms of what you were describing, because Bridge will tell you that I often talk talked about myself being a walking head because I had no emotion, no sensation. Below that, sort of like I almost like got myself stood to attention constantly, that everything else was blocked off. So that disconnect, I can really resonate. And we often attempt to have me give a quote at the end of our session as we're coming to saying goodbye to each other.
Bobby gets very upset if I try and give any quotes at any point during the podcast. So we're going back to just Bobby giving a quote at the end.
We had a recording earlier on today where she gave two, and it looked like she was going to give ones that I'd got ready for the end of the session. Not that I'm tempestuous or irate or anything like that, but this one resonates with something that Ali was just saying. And it's by somebody called Jacob Norby. And they say, every pain, addiction, anguish, longing, depression, anger or fear is an orphaned part of a seeking joy, some disowned shadow wanting to return to the light and home of ourselves. And I absolutely loved that, having seen on the website about the journey home and that connection, which is to others and equally is back to self. So I thought that might be a nice way to end. And I have absolutely loved talking to both of you. Despite our technical machinations, we have somehow got ourselves to the end of this recording with some lovely, lovely conversations, some storytelling and some really, really brilliant stuff to, I hope, to be able to have you share with everybody so that we can also promote the charity and the great work.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's been a joy and really, really interesting, but really grateful that you were able to open up and share. And I think that the sort of honesty and vulnerability are so important to make sure that the message continues to be shared. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. All of the resources are on the More Than a Lumpy Jumper website and on the Spotify podcast page. For anyone affected by these issues, do get in touch with Fighting with Pride. Next week, we're talking about something everyone loves to hate: networking. And we're reframing it into making connections and building relationships, which doesn't sound so frightening. It's even coaxed me away from the bar and canapes to actually, shock horror, speak to people I don't know. So come and join us for being an intentional networker.